They admired you when you were manageable, palatable, when your intelligence was just clever enough to amuse them, not yet sharp enough to unsettle them. Back then, your thoughts were interesting anecdotes, not threats. You were the quirky one, the observer, the quiet storm they didn't know was gathering force. But then your genius evolved, not in noise, but in depth. Your mind stopped asking for permission to stretch. You stopped shaping your ideas to fit their fears. And that's when they stopped smiling. That's when they started looking away. Because what lives in your brain now doesn't comfort. It confronts. It doesn't flatter. It disturbs. Your genius isn't normal. It doesn't play by their rules. It doesn't offer safe conclusions or polite hesitations. It stands up in rooms built on falsehoods and quietly burns everything that was never real. They wanted brilliance with boundaries. They wanted innovation with humility, intellect without disruption. But you brought something ancient, primal. You brought insight sharpened by solitude, sharpened by rejection, refined through 1,000 nights of silence while the world danced in echo chambers. You built yourself in the dark, where no one clapped, no one helped, no one understood. And now, you speak in a dialect of truth, too fluent to be ignored. That's why they can't look at you. Not because they don't see you, but because you see through them. You see the lies they've internalized, the masks they forgot they're wearing, the dreams they buried beneath comfort. Your presence calls out everything they've avoided, and that's not welcome. That's terrifying. You are the reflection they don't want, the evidence that they could have done more, thought deeper, asked better questions, but they didn't. And now you're the consequence, a living rebuke to mediocrity. They can't stand it. Because your genius doesn't ask for validation, it removes the need for it. You don't debate to be right. You speak because silence offends you more than their opinion. You dissect with precision, not to impress, to liberate. And that's what really unsettles them. You don't use your mind to climb their ladder. You use it to dismantle the ladder entirely. While they play power games, you rewrite the rules and walk off with the board. You didn't arrive loud, you arrived accurate. And accuracy is surgical. It cuts deep, especially in those who have something to hide. Your genius makes people uncomfortable because it demands evolution. It doesn't care for fragile egos or curated reputations. You don't flatter, you reveal. And revelation is a mirror few want to stand before. That's why they avoid your gaze now, why they scoff or joke when you speak. Self-defense. They sense your mind not as a weapon, but as an X-ray, and they don't want to be seen. You're not aggressive, you're just unignorable. And that's worse, because aggression they can fight. But truth is radioactive. It lingers long after you leave. They'll call you difficult, too intense, too analytical. They'll say you're always in your head. But that's projection. What they mean is you think in ways they can't follow. You question things they never dared to examine. You navigate life with a compass built from contradiction, paradox, and realism. You don't chase light, you dissect shadows. You don't memorize answers, you create better questions. And your intelligence has no off switch. That's why they're uneasy. Not because you're unstable, but because you're free. Free from groupthink, free from the performance of humility, free from needing their comfort to feel secure. You built a mind they can't decorate, so now they pretend it doesn't exist. Psychologically, people are wired to reject what threatens their identity. Your genius does exactly that. It challenges the illusions they've built their lives on. Most minds seek confirmation. Yours seeks confrontation. You walk into a room and without a word raise the intellectual temperature by degrees. Your thoughts demand an environment that can hold complexity, and they can't give it. That's why they pull back. That's why your texts go unanswered, your brilliance dismissed, your questions unanswered. Not because you're wrong, because you're right, in ways they're not ready to accept. You didn't get left behind, you moved beyond. And now, they can't bear to watch you operate on a plane they can't even reach. Let them call it arrogance. Let them accuse you of being too much. That's how the slow respond to the fast. That's how the safe respond to the dangerous. You're not here to comfort the comfortable. You're here to wake the dead. And to the dead, light always looks violent. Your genius doesn't smile when it enters. It interrupts. It tears holes in facades and rebuilds thought like architecture. You've stopped waiting for seats at tables that shrink your presence. You build new tables now, where your language is not diluted, where your thoughts are not misnamed as rebellion, where your hunger to know more is not labeled a flaw. The irony is, you never asked for this effect. You didn't design your genius to repel. You designed it to understand, but deep understanding offends shallow systems. You offer perspective and they respond with resistance. You offer insight and they flee with indifference. Let them. Their rejection is proof of your clarity. They can't meet you eye to eye because your mind doesn't blink. It sees patterns in chaos. It hears dishonesty in tone. It questions what they told themselves they'd never question. And in that sense, your genius becomes spiritual. It purifies by force, not by violence, by vision. They were doing just fine before you spoke, just fine in their delusions, just fine in their curated routines of pretending, deflecting, and distorting. They wore comfort like a second skin, comfort not built from truth, but from habit, unquestioned belief, fragile narratives carefully passed around like heirlooms no one dared to examine. Then you came in, not loudly, not rudely, but cruel, and clarity by its very nature is cruel to comfort. You didn't attack them. You didn't shame them. You simply refused to look away from what was, and in that refusal, you made them see it too. That's why they turned on you. That's why they now say you've changed. Not because you grew toxic, but because your presence made stagnation visible. You didn't bring drama. You brought reality. And reality offends those who've spent years customizing their cages to look like freedom. You said things they were avoiding. You named things they never wanted named. You saw the patterns they were invested in denying. And you did it without apology, without theatrics, without the politeness they'd come to rely on to keep everything hidden. Your clarity became a threat, not because it was cruel, but because it was clean. They had wrapped their flaws in justification. You unwrapped them. They called it judgment, but what it really was consequence. You didn't expose them. You illuminated them. And illumination always makes the liar squint. Comfort demands conformity, and you stopped conforming. You no longer nodded at dysfunction to keep the peace. You no longer laughed at jokes rooted in pain. You no longer accepted explanations that were more decoration than truth. That's the disruption they felt. Your clarity made their equilibrium wobble, not because you were unkind, but because you were uncompromising. You had evolved out of the group contract, the one that says, let's pretend so no one has to grow. You didn't sign it anymore. You brought your own terms, your own mirror. And for people committed to self-avoidance, that kind of clarity feels like betrayal. They didn't see it coming because you never raised your voice. Your shift was internal, refined, strategic, irrevocable. You started asking better questions, the kind that can't be answered with cliches. You stopped excusing patterns just because they were familiar. You stopped mistaking loyalty for silence. That's when the cracks showed. The ones who depended on your confusion panicked. The ones who used your doubt as a leash recoiled, because clarity is a declaration, not of war, of independence. And nothing terrifies the comfortably deluded more than someone who no longer depends on the group lie to sleep at night. You became the conversation killer, the mood shifter, the one whose gaze made people clear their throat and check their words twice. You didn't mean to intimidate, but clarity always does. Because most people don't speak to be understood, they speak to be accepted. And you began responding with truth, not to correct them, to correct yourself. You stopped betraying your own intelligence just to keep them comfortable. And now, they call you intense, difficult, judgmental. That's how the uncomfortable cope with the one who sees too much. They label your insight as hostility because it forces them to see themselves. Clarity doesn't just alter relationships, it demolishes dynamics. It makes hierarchy impossible. Once you start seeing, really seeing, you can't play roles anymore. You won't unlearn the betrayal they called normal. You won't participate in the denial that once felt like belonging. Your presence started feeling like resistance, because it was. It was resistance to small talk when the room was screaming, resistance to nodding while your soul disagreed, resistance to the script they passed around like gospel. You stopped reading from it. You started writing your own, and every word you spoke became a fault line under their fantasy. They'll say you outgrew them, that you became arrogant, that you lost touch. But what they mean is, you stopped pretending. You stopped dimming your awareness. You stopped carrying the weight of their unspoken fears. And in doing so, you revealed just how much they relied on your blindness. That's the real betrayal. You didn't leave them. You just stopped shielding them from their reflection. And now every interaction with you feels dangerous because your clarity forces honesty. Not out loud, but inward. And most people are at war with their own mind. They don't want peace. They want distraction. You took that away. You started walking with different posture, saying less but meaning more. You became intolerant of emotional clutter. Your standards started acting like alarms, and only those willing to grow didn't get triggered. That's the price of clarity. You lose comfort, gain vision. You lose approval, gain alignment. You lose company, gain conviction. And those who remained only did so because they, too, were ready to bleed their illusion. Everyone else, they drifted, or turned on you, or whispered about how you'd become too deep, too different, too awake. But they forgot this version of you didn't ask for permission. It emerged with blood in its mouth and fire in its chest. The truth is, your clarity didn't disrupt their comfort by accident. It was designed to. Not maliciously, but necessarily. Growth disrupts, truth ruptures, and presence, real presence, destabilizes every system built on deception. You became a living reminder that the world doesn't have to stay small, that language can be used for something other than hiding, that love doesn't require pretending. And for those still addicted to the safety of illusion, that kind of reminder is too much. So they turn away, they exit, they label, but deep down, they remember. You didn't hurt them, you woke them, and they weren't ready to rise. So they cursed the alarm clock. They were comfortable in the performance. Their roles rehearsed, their masks fitted tight, their truths diluted until they could be swallowed without guilt. Then you began to see. And not just see, but speak. Not with venom, but with unnerving accuracy. You didn't accuse, you exposed. Not by calling anyone out, but by calling yourself forward. Your evolution wasn't loud, but it was disruptive. You brought clarity into rooms where confusion was currency, and that clarity became a weapon without a blade. They could feel it in your silence, in your refusal to nod at the lies, in your ability to say exactly what needed to be said without shaking. They weren't afraid of what you knew. They were afraid of what it forced them to confront in themselves. You weren't trying to tear them down. You were just done kneeling. You didn't come to dismantle their world. You simply refused to live in it anymore. And that choice, that shift in your posture, in your gaze, in the way you no longer entertained their emotional theater. That's what rattled them. They relied on your confusion. They counted on your need for approval. They fed on your silence like it was air. But clarity starves parasites. You stopped apologizing for your insight. You stopped mistrusting your instincts. And the moment you reclaimed your knowing, the entire atmosphere changed. Because your clarity wasn't just yours. It was contagious. And those addicted to comfort fear nothing more than a mind that no longer bends. You held up a mirror not out of cruelty, but because you were done being complicit. You held it still, without judgment, and still, they called you cruel. Because clarity, in a world trained to lie beautifully, always feels like violence. You weren't breaking anyone. You were simply refusing to let yourself stay broken. And that refusal triggered every soul still in denial. They didn't want you to grow. Their comfort was built on your confusion, your doubt, your habit of second-guessing your own truth. When you stripped those away, they lost control, not just of you, but of the reality they curated around your blindness. You had been the silence that protected them, the softness that excused them, the echo chamber that let them avoid transformation. But you don't echo anymore. You disrupt, you dissect, you declare. Your clarity became the end of their peace, because it was never real peace to begin with. It was convenience dressed as connection, safety dressed as loyalty. But you saw past it. And now they call you harsh, because truth always sounds like rage to those who've been lulled to sleep by flattery. You found your own voice in the quiet, and when it came back, it didn't beg, it confronted. It didn't tremble, it revealed. And revelation is the death of illusion. That's why they avoid your eyes now, because your gaze no longer seeks validation. It sees motive, it sees habits, it sees agendas. You aren't the same person they could manipulate with guilt or flatter into submission. You no longer accommodate dysfunction to feel loved. You outgrew the need to be liked by those who only loved the version of you that kept their lies alive. Your clarity made it impossible to stay in the same dynamics. You didn't walk away because you were angry. You walked away because you finally understood the cost of staying. You used to water every relationship with understanding, but understanding without truth is poison. And now that you've detoxed, your very presence unsettles those still sipping the syrup of denial. You don't fight them, you don't correct them, you simply exist. And that's enough. That's the villain they whisper about. The one who doesn't bend, doesn't explain, doesn't comfort mediocrity with fake grace. They'll label you distant, they'll call you arrogant. But that's the language of those who cannot reach you. You don't speak in guilt anymore. You speak in boundaries. You speak in standards. And that, to those who only knew how to extract, feels like betrayal. You are not who they thought you were, and that haunts them. Because now they have to ask, who were they when you were pretending? Who were they when you were too loyal to speak your truth? The answer isn't flattering, and clarity demands they face it. That's why they turn their faces when you enter. That's why they keep their distance. Not because you did something wrong, but because you stopped doing what was easy. You no longer provide the illusion of harmony. You provide the challenge of authenticity. And for those not ready to meet themselves, that is unbearable. You don't wish them harm. You don't seek revenge. But your clarity has consequences, because it forces recalibration. People can no longer lie with ease in your presence. Their jokes land differently. Their excuses echo in the silence you leave behind. You've become the reference point for what realness looks like, and they hate it, because they know they'll never again feel right playing roles in front of you. You are now the line in the sand, the shift they didn't prepare for, and they'll feel it long after you're gone. Because once a lie is seen, it can't be unseen. And you became the seeing. You didn't become their enemy because you changed. You became their enemy because you reminded them of everything they chose not to be. They saw in you what they buried in themselves, potential they never explored, pain they never processed, standards they never upheld. You weren't a threat until you stopped apologizing for your growth, until you stopped shrinking to fit their emotional furniture. They tolerated you when you blended in. They even praised your potential so long as it stayed dormant. But the moment you started embodying it, the tone changed. Now you're difficult, too intense, hard to be around. They don't see you. They see what they repressed. And to the unhealed, nothing feels more hostile than your freedom. You didn't break the friendship, you broke the mirror. You didn't cause the discomfort, you revealed its source. You became the walking reminder of the things they excused, the conversations they avoided, the disciplines they abandoned. Your evolution wasn't passive, it was reflective. And when people live in denial, even your silence becomes provocative. You didn't have to say a word. Your presence alone brought shame out of hiding, and shame always fights to survive. So they'll attack you not because of what you did, but because of what you represent. A version of themselves that demands accountability. A version they don't have the courage to meet. That's why they avoid you now, because healing is hard, and you remind them of everything they're still pretending doesn't need to be healed. You were once safe for them, a fellow prisoner of the same narratives, the same compromises. But you found the key, and worse, you used it. You left the cell. And now your freedom stings. It pokes holes in their excuses. It shines a spotlight on every place they've refused to grow. You are no longer in agreement with their stagnation. And for those addicted to being seen without being challenged, that feels like betrayal. They don't miss you. They miss the version of you that didn't threaten their comfort. And that version is dead. You buried it with the lies they taught you to swallow, and you grieved it in silence long before they noticed you'd gone. They'll tell a different story, of course. One where you changed, one where you lost yourself or let ego win, because to admit the truth would require admitting they stood still, that they mistook coping for healing, that they stayed in the same cycles while you bled your way out. So they rewrite you in their narrative. They make you the villain. Because it's easier than facing the real question. What if I could have grown too? But they didn't. And now they watch you from a distance, equal parts curious and furious. Because deep down, they know. You didn't betray them. You just stopped betraying yourself. And in doing so, you became a mirror they never asked for. You are a disruption, not because you're angry, but because you're clear. You say what others avoid. You draw lines where others leave space for exploitation. You expect honesty and you give it, even when it costs you connection. They don't hate your truth, they hate that it works, that it resonates, that it holds up under scrutiny. You became the one they can't gaslight, and for manipulators, that's intolerable. You became immune to shame, immune to guilt, immune to their tactics. That's what makes you dangerous in their eyes. Not your actions, your awareness. You saw through them, and once you see, you can't unsee. Now your clarity walks in first, and they flinch before you even open your mouth. They thought they could outgrow you by standing still while pretending they were moving. But you moved for real. You learned to hold your own reflection without flinching. You unpacked the trauma, the self-sabotage, the bad habits they kept wrapping in new words. You didn't chase healing, you crawled through it. And now you carry a presence they don't know how to process, because it says one thing you could have come to. You didn't leave them. They stayed. And now they hate the proof of what was always possible, not in theory. In you. You are the walking evidence that the old life wasn't survival. It was submission. They wonder how you did it, how you broke out without warning. But they didn't see the nights you sat with your darkness and refused to run. The days you said no to what used to feel like love. They don't understand the price you paid for your clarity, so now they discount its value. They mock it, dismiss it, pretend you're performing. But no one performs, like the ones still playing characters in a life they didn't design. Your clarity cost you everything, and you paid without complaint. That's why it's real, that's why it lands like thunder and doesn't ask for permission to echo.